There was just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode is about real-life events. It contains adult themes and language. Listener discretion is advised.
It was October 18, 1975, when a farmer found the body of a young woman floating face down in the Gulf of Thailand. Teresa Knowlton was wearing a floral bikini, a detail that journalists would use to eventually brand her murderer, the Bikini Killer. The 21-year-old had travelled to Bangkok from Seattle in the US and was following the Hippie Trail that would eventually lead her to study Tibetan Buddhism at Kopan Monastery in Kathmandu. But along the way, she'd met someone. Although accounts differ, it appears that a man invited Teresa to his home in Pattaya, about 100 kilometres southeast of Bangkok. There, it's likely her drink was poisoned, and then she was invited out for a swim. She would become the first victim of a man who would come to be known as the Serpent, and his crimes would only get worse. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Julie Clark, the co-author of On the Trail of the Serpent, which details the life and crimes of Charles Sobhraj. Julie and her partner, Richard Neville, spent 3 years researching and writing about Charles, even travelling to Delhi, where he told them first-hand accounts of what he'd done. I wanted to begin by asking, what was the Hippie Trail in the 60s and 70s?
Well, it was what people did in their gap year. You'd often take 6 months or a year after uni or after you'd saved up some money after high school, and you'd travel from Australia to Europe, and you could go basically all the way overland. And it was an absolute scene. It was like everybody did it. And then obviously kids from Europe came to Australia. And so for maybe 10 or 15 years, starting in the mid-60s, I guess to the 80s, everyone travelled across Asia and overland. And that was usually done in a combi van with a block of hash.
And you actually did that trail with a group of friends in 1975. At the time, had you heard anything about Charles Sobhraj?
No, there absolutely wasn't. It was still an innocent paradise, and it was very innocent and kind of comparatively safe. When you think of all the countries we went through, it was safe. The local people were just pretty excited and amazed to meet Europeans, and they were very kind and welcoming. And so everything was going really well. And then the year after I finished the trip, I was working as a journalist in New York, and my partner, Richard Neville, was freelancing as a writer in New York. And these news stories started to come through that someone had just been arrested for murdering hippies on the Overland Trail. And we were just so shocked because there was nothing like that. It just seemed to be a very safe experience. And so once we heard that story, a publisher offered us the job of going to India, where Charles Sobhraj had been arrested, and writing his life story, which he had sold to the publisher. And even though we weren't interested in crime reporting at that stage, what we were interested in was the Hippie Trail, and we felt duty-bound to cover the story because we felt so close to all the kids who had been murdered, and we were just so surprised that such a thing had happened.
Of course, and this is a place where you had only just been and felt safe.
Yeah, where you'd sleep on the beach and, usually nothing was stolen. It was a dreamlike place for a while, that Hippie Trail. And then this monster sort of turned up.
And when you began looking into his life, starting with his childhood, where did he grow up and what did you find out about his upbringing?
We found that he'd been born in Saigon. His mum was a Vietnamese, I suppose you'd say, peasant. She left the rubber plantations where her family came from and came to Saigon, where she met a man called Hotchand Sobhraj. And he was an Indian from the Valley of Sindh, and he was a moneylender and a tailor, and he was a successful businessman in Saigon. And she was working in one of his shops, and she became his mistress, and Charles was born as a result. But Charles's father went to India and married an Indian woman because he had an arranged marriage he had to deal with. So Charles's mother left and married a French soldier who did not have much money or position but was a very kind and sensitive man. And then Charles felt he'd lost access to the money and position that he felt he had with his father, who had a big apartment with servants. And Charles was always running away to get back to his Indian father. And his mum, who was probably hadn't read hundreds of child psychology books, would tie him to the bed. And he wet the bed, she'd tie a string around his penis. Also, the war was still going on. Saigon was being bombed. So when the bombings were going on, she would push Charles under a heavy wardrobe and leave him there, to be safe, but it also wouldn't have been a very nice experience. So he did have a lot of trauma. Then the family moved to Paris, and Charles was a fish out of water, did very badly at school, and he committed his first crime very early on. I think he was 16 or 17. He read about an armed hold-up, and he thought, I could do that. So he went off to an apartment building and held up a young mother who was holding her baby and got all the cash from her apartment. And he was arrested. And that was the beginning of his criminal career.
When did the gambling start for him?
Well, I presume it would have started whenever he could get into a casino, because his mum was a gambling addict and he was a gambling addict as well. So I don't know when it began, but it would have begun as soon as he could legally go to a casino. And that also exacerbated his need for large amounts of money, because he'd just gamble, lose everything, and then he'd have to urgently get money.
Yeah.
So he never really had a life of non-crime with a normal job. Like, he had about 3 tiny little jobs, but he sort of went straight into crime. That was his career, and he was very proud of all his techniques.
And it was, I think, 1970 when he actually left France in a bid to escape arrest along with his pregnant partner at the time. Why do you think he went to Asia?
Well, he felt at home in Asia. He really disliked Europeans. Sometimes he would talk to us about, European colonials raping Asia. But he felt that he could operate in Asia better than he could in Europe. And that was true. He could. And he did. So that first escape to Asia with his first wife was amazing. They drove from Paris to Bombay. And he quickly set himself up in an apartment in Bombay and befriended movie stars and was, hanging out with high society, and got involved in car smuggling, and he was into the black market. So he was procuring things for, well-heeled Indians. But then he would always push his luck.
Mm.
He would always do one crime too far and then he'd get arrested.
Because there were a lot of robberies sort of taking place in the early 70s. What was his strategy to kind of rob, I suppose, tourists or the people that he met?
He could basically befriend just about anyone. He could befriend a diplomat, a doctor, a hippie, and just get chatting. And because of his mixed race and his perfect French and his other languages, he was multilingual, he would just get chatting in a really nice way, the way people do when they're travelling. like, where have you just been? Or he'd overhear you say something and he'd just join in. And then, you'd have a drink with him and you'd have another drink with him and you'd be talking and he'd be riveting and interesting, and whatever you were interested in, he'd know about. And then he would drop ground up sleeping pills into your drink when you weren't looking. And then you would start feeling woozy and he'd say, oh, you've got, deli belly or whatever. Let me take you back to your hotel room. So, it'd look quite normal and he'd just walk you back to your hotel room, holding you up, and he'd say, I think they've drunk too much or something like that if anyone looked askance. And so then he'd get your key, let you into your hotel room. He might then give you an injection of another sleeping draft or something to make sure you were fully wiped out. And then he'd clean the room out. He'd get passport, traveller's checks, key to the safe if you had one. He'd then leave the room. He'd put a do not disturb sign on the door. He'd go down with the key to the safe and get everything out of the safe. He would then go and cash the traveller's checks because he'd have your passport and your traveller's checks. These are old-fashioned things we used to have. He could make $20,000 in one hit.
Did he have a specific kind of victim, or was he pretty much just an opportunist, whoever was there?
He was definitely an opportunist. It would just depend on when he suddenly needed money, who came into the bar at that moment. So that's how he operated. He was confident enough to pick up anyone.
And eventually his first wife went home and sort of left him on the run, and he met another woman named Marie-Andre Leclerc. What was she like?
Well, I met her when she was in jail. She'd been arrested with him at that point. And I don't know if you saw the series The Serpent. She was very interestingly portrayed in that.
Was that accurate?
Well, it was accurate except far more glamorous. She was a completely normal girl who had a very boring life in Quebec and went on a first little overseas holiday to Kashmir, where she was unlucky enough to meet Charles, and he could sweep any woman off their feet. And so she came back to join him in Bangkok. I feel great pity for her because she was allowed to leave jail to go home to die from ovarian cancer. But she loved him right to the end. I mean, even after she knew everything he did. We don't know at what point she knew what he was doing, but at some point she did know everything. She kept on loving him right up to the end. Charles actually gave us love letters that she used to write to him in jail. They're heartbreaking. It just goes to show what a psychopath can do, and that women need to be very careful with men like that.
Yeah, who are manipulating them. And I suppose that's a theme. He then met AJ Chowdhury, who became almost his second in command. And I'm interested in that relationship too, because do you see AJ as a follower or sort of entirely complicit in what happened next?
AJ is a mystery to me. He's the only person we didn't meet because he disappeared. I think he was definitely a follower. Charles actually told us that he'd been sent to him to help with the murders by a Hong Kong heroin gang. We do not have any idea if that's true, but there's no doubt AJ and Charles committed the murders together, and Charles was using AJ as a henchman.
And when was their first murder and how did it take place?
The first murder was Teresa Knowlton. She was a very young American girl, a true hippie of the time, and she was on her way to Kopan Monastery in Kathmandu. She met AJ at the Malaysia Hotel, and he invited her back to the apartment, and her body was later found drowned. It just seemed like she had drowned, but actually Charles and AJ had taken her to Pattaya, drugged her and taken her out into the water so that she would drown.
And what was their motive?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question. Richard and I spent a year working on the motive for the murders because Charles described all the murders to Richard, and he said his motivation was that he'd been hired to wipe out amateur heroin couriers. And there is a possibility that that's true. But, for example, with Teresa, we couldn't find out one way or the other. She certainly is the sort of person who would have done that. And a lot of people were at that point in time. A lot of people would have thought it wasn't a big deal to carry a parcel from Hong Kong to Kathmandu and not ask what was in it.
And it wasn't just women who he murdered, was it?
No, not at all. I don't think there was any sexual component in the murders at all. I mean, it really did seem to us like about 80% probable that he was wiping out amateur heroin couriers. When they made the Serpent, they didn't want to go with that theory. And also, it's not a sort of nice thing to say about anyone after they've been murdered anyway. But we knew for sure, because we had very good contacts in Ibiza and Formentera, that we were able to find out that some of the people were doing heroin runs. So maybe some were and some weren't. We just couldn't pin anything down on the other people, and we didn't even want to because...
There's no right of reply.
Yeah, exactly. It was a messy situation.
And did they have a particular system that they employed with these victims? So often you see with serial killers that they have a certain process by which they murder particular people. Were they leaving a trail?
Well, firstly, I'd say that I wouldn't call Sobhraj a serial killer. It seems that he just suddenly had these series of murders that he committed. And, you know, according to him, they were all couriers, and that's why he did it. When they made the Serpent series, they came up with a kind of a psychological theory that Charles was inviting these kids to do some smuggling for him, and if they said no, he would then be worried that they knew too much and he'd wipe them out.
Right.
And that's also possible.
How many people all up was Charles responsible for killing?
Well, there was some accidental deaths. After the gruesome murders, the murders of the young people in Thailand and Kathmandu, then he went back to having some accidental deaths, because when you're drugging people to rob them, you sometimes overdose and they die, and that's what happened. So he had 2 more accidental deaths while he was on the run before he was finally arrested. And before he started his Bangkok killing spree, he had also killed a driver in Pakistan. He hired a car with a driver, drugged the driver, popped the driver into the boot, drove across the desert, and was surprised when the driver was dead, 4 hours later. He always said he didn't take any pleasure in killing, it was just business. He was completely cold-blooded because he was a psychopath.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Julie Clark about her book, On the Trail of the Serpent, The Life and Crimes of Charles Sobhraj. It was the end of 1975 when things started to really unravel for him and AJ. What happened? How were all of these crimes tied together in the end?
There was a fabulous girl called Nadine Girez, who was a French girl. Her husband worked in a local 5-star hotel, I think the Dusit Thani, and they became friends with Charles and Marie-Andre because they were also French speakers. So Nadine would hang out up in the apartment and meet everyone who came and went. But she was the one who started to notice that young people would come to a party at the apartment. She wouldn't see them again, but she'd see their suitcase or their necklace they were wearing or something would still be in the apartment. And she just started to notice something a bit strange. And there was also another boy called Dominique Renelot, who Charles was sort of keeping drugged and using as a servant, a very strange relationship. And Dominic and Nadine basically in the end realised what was going on. The Bangkok Post published photos of the bodies of the murder victims and they recognised them, even though sometimes they were burnt, but they recognised that they were kids who'd been at parties in the apartment. And so that's when Nadine began going to the police and the embassies. She helped Dominique to escape back to France, and she did everything she could to alert authorities to Charles Sobhraj, but nobody was at the slightest bit interested. And it took her a long time, and then finally she met a fantastic Dutch diplomat who was only 31 on his first posting, called Herman Nippenberg. And he'd been contacted about the Dutch couple who were murdered, and he started really seriously looking for them. And so eventually he and Nadine, in the small world of expatriate Bangkok, met each other, and then they got down to business of, working everything out and writing reports and finding evidence in the apartment. And eventually, because of them, Charles got onto the Interpol's most wanted list and was arrested.
And by the time he was arrested, that's when you and Richard started this project, I suppose. And Richard actually spent a lot of time with Charles. How did he describe him?
Well, we both met all of the characters, but Richard and Charles, because, Charles had agreed in his contract to tell the whole story, Richard and Charles would spend many hours a day in a little room off the courtroom, and Charles told Richard everything. And I've still got the tapes, and he described every murder. He described everything.
This sounds like such a strange question to ask, but were there elements of him that were likeable? Because he manipulated a lot of people.
I kept on trying to imagine, if I didn't know what he'd done and I just met him at a bar, how would I feel about him?
Yes.
I would have liked him. I would have thought he had a wonderful face. He had beautiful high cheekbones and a sensuous mouth and astonishing eyes. He had the face of a poet, and he was so intelligent, and he just picked up on everything. When we met him the first time in the courtroom, we didn't know for sure that he was a murderer, but it was pretty likely. But I still wanted him to like me. I wanted him to be impressed by me. I found that in my journal, and I was very disappointed in myself that I'd written that. I'd always used to say, I've got a really good bullshit detector with people, but no. Even knowing that he was probably a killer, he had the kind of presence and gravitas of a really famous person.
So when Charles was arrested, at first he wasn't actually charged with murder, was he?
No, he was finally arrested in India. He was on the run and he'd ended up in Delhi. He needed a lot of passports and travelers checks because he actually was planning to escape to South America. So he decided, instead of doing just a drug and rob of, one couple or one person, he saw a whole French tour group arrive at a hotel, and he decided he would do a drug and rob on the whole 30 of the French tour group. They were a group of students.
Wow.
And he did it, but he got his dosages wrong. And everybody started vomiting at the dinner in the hotel. Because he said to them, have some of these pills, it'll stop you getting dysentery. These are fantastic pills. So everyone took them. And an hour later, while they're all sitting down to dinner, they all start throwing up, and the whole restaurant was awash in vomit, and people were unconscious, and it was an amazing scene. And that's when he was finally arrested.
And so he was arrested and charged and spent a lot of time in jail, and then I believe he was released for a period.
Yes, he was never able to be charged with the murders in Thailand because he purposely stayed in an Indian jail long enough that the Thais couldn't extradite him. And in the end, the Indians had to release him. He had to be freed. So he never did actually go to Thailand and face the murder charges there. But there were still charges for murder in Kathmandu. So after he was free, which I think lasted about 8 years, and he didn't really know what to do with himself while he was free. I mean, what do you do when you're a famous serial killer and you're suddenly free and you're living in Paris? Well, he didn't know what to do with himself. And the next thing you know, he goes back to Kathmandu, the only place in the world where there's an arrest warrant. And he goes to Kathmandu and he makes a big fuss so people know he's there. He goes and gambles. Everyone quickly realises it's him. And then some of the police say, well, I think the arrest warrant is still standing for those murders. And so then, very complicated, long story, but they've got him and he's now been in jail in Kathmandu, living through an earthquake, open heart surgery, and now COVID, and he's 78 and he's still alive. That's astonishing.
Julie Clark has an extensive career in media, working as a journalist for the Sydney Telegraph and the ABC, as well as a TV producer and New York correspondent for Australian Consolidated Press. She wrote on the trail of the Serpent, the life and crimes of Charles Sobhraj with her partner Richard Neville. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you enjoyed this episode of True Crime Conversations, then leave us a review on your favourite podcast app or share us with your friends so more people can hear our episodes.